Circling back to one of our top stories, aid agencies are bracing for emergency response after Cyclone Mocha hit the coastlines of Bangladesh and Myanmar. At least 5 people have died.
More than 1,300 shelters in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee camp, have also been destroyed.
For more on Cyclone Mocha, Professor Mark Howden joins us. He's Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at Australian National University. Professor, Cyclone Mocha slammed into Bangladesh and Myanmar. These are vulnerable countries at the best of times. What does a Category 5 cyclone mean for them?
Good morning, Stephen. Anything beyond a Category 3 is going to be pretty life-threatening in those environments. Once we go up to the Categories 4 and 5, so wind speeds in excess of 200 kilometres an hour, we see an exponential increase in damage and potential damage to infrastructure and to people and to the natural environment. One of the really important things that happens with these intense cyclones is they push water in front of them, and they also raise water underneath them. So we get what's called a storm surge, and that can essentially be like a tsunami moving across low-lying coastal areas, adding to the damage that they cause.
Professor, the storm missed the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, but we're seeing reports saying people fled on foot to shelters. They had their belongings, even taking their livestock with them. What would you say are the most significant humanitarian concerns right now?
I think there's going to be ongoing concerns. There's the immediate ones associated with damage from the high winds and storm surge, but then ongoing challenges through flooding, particularly inland flooding, which may occur in the Irrawaddy Delta with high-intensity rainfall in that area, things like landslides. And, of course, there's ongoing challenges in terms of getting good, clean water and getting health supplies and help, food, etc., to these people. I think there's going to be a very significant ongoing challenge here.
In 2008, Cyclone Nargis hit the region, killing more than 138,000 people. What in particular made that storm so deadly, and what has changed in terms of forecasting and evacuation planning since then?
Well, I think it's a really important point. In the past, we've seen many big cyclones and typhoons hitting places without much warning and without much in the way of good planning to deal with these challenges. And so since that time that you mentioned, there's been very significant improvements in the forecasting capability in Bangladesh and India and across the world as part of a cyclone forecasting upgrade. But importantly, in many countries, there's better cyclone action plans put in place. Because there's no sense in just having a forecast. You actually have to have an action plan that gets people out of the harm's way well in time before the cyclone hits land. But also, I think, to have ongoing improvements in infrastructure so that there's less damage when the cyclones do hit.
Earlier, you spoke about mudslides and inland flooding, Professor. So as residents in Bangladesh and Myanmar start returning to their homes now, what is most urgently needed?
Well, I think it'll vary depending on the individuals, the families, locations and damage, of course. But I think the immediate things that people need is access to clean water and good food and shelter. And so many of those people in that refugee camp, as I understand it, have very limited shelter in the first place, just bamboo and tarpaulins as their home. And of course, those are not designed to withstand cyclones of this strength. So just immediate humanitarian aid is going to be critical for those people. And then there's going to be those ongoing challenges in terms of rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding lives that happen after these big events.
Professor, if we sort of zoom out a bit and look at the bigger context of this, how does climate change factor into how such storms spawn, as well as their sort of intensity and frequency?
Well, as the cyclones are generated by lots of warm water, so lots of energy in the ocean, and also particular wind characteristics, so not a lot of sideways wind, what we call wind shear. And with global warming, we're seeing increases in sea surface temperature. And, for example, the immediate period before this cyclone, the temperatures in the Bay of Bengal were around about 1 to 1.5 degrees warmer than their long-term average. So there's lots and lots of energy, lots of humidity in that atmosphere, and that generates very strong cyclones. So we're seeing proportionately more of the cyclones are now category 3, 4, or 5, the really bad ones, than there used to be. So that's gone up significantly globally and in many ocean basins across the world. What we're also seeing is an increase in the intensification rate, so what we call rapid intensification. So these cyclones increase their wind speeds very quickly. From day to day, they can increase their wind speeds very markedly. And that seems to be associated with climate change as well. And also what we're seeing is some cyclones have incredible longevity. So the longest cyclone ever recorded was recently in the Indian Ocean, Cyclone Freddie, and that lasted for more than 5 weeks. So we're seeing a whole range of different characteristics of cyclones change with climate change, including those cyclones extending further towards the poles, so more towards the North Pole in the Northern Hemisphere, more towards the South Pole in the Southern Hemisphere. So the latitudes where they occur is actually increasing as well.
Professor, a number of vulnerable nations line the Indian Ocean. Is that a particularly concerning region in the world?
Yes, the Indian Ocean is, but there's many other places. So if we look across the Caribbean, for example, but also in parts of the Pacific, we see high levels of vulnerability to cyclones. And that's simply because these are big things that are very, very hard to deal with. The wind speeds are extraordinary, and it's very hard to actually design systems to cope with those. And many of those places that you just mentioned have very significant amounts of people and infrastructure in low-lying zones, and they're particularly vulnerable to cyclones and to storm surge. And so, yes, cyclones are a big threat right around the Indian Ocean, but also in other parts of the world.
Professor, thank you for your expertise this morning. Professor Mark Howden from the Australian National University.